Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar. Please sit tight for about a minute or so while we get everyone in, and we will get started in about 1 minute. Thank you. For those of you who just joined, we're going to get started in a little less than a minute. We're just getting more people into the webinar, and then we'll get started in a minute. Okay, well, I'm going to get us started. I just want to start off by thanking everyone for joining this webinar tonight. This is clearly information that everyone is eager to have because we had almost 200 RSVPs for the webinar tonight and lots of people who couldn't make it. And so we will be sending out recordings to anyone who RSVP'd. But we really appreciate you joining us so that we can start sharing information on how to protect our communities against data centers and start to get to work all across the state. We are going to have the chat and the Q&A available on Zoom. So if you come up with any questions throughout the webinar, just put those in the Q&A and then feel free to chat back and forth amongst each other's in the chat. And if you want to introduce yourself and let people know where you're from, feel free to do that as well. But Iowa, we have clearly got a problem. Data centers are proposed all across the state, and these facilities use a ton of our resources, and they change the landscape of our communities. I was not prepared at the state level. We don't even have a public database of where the data centers are, where they're being proposed, and how much of our resources that they're using. And that leaves it up to us and our communities to pass ordinances that protect our water, our energy, our quality of life, transparency, and more. At least 16 counties across the state have passed data center moratoriums, but then what? Moratoriums are only temporary. That's what this webinar is for, to talk about data center ordinances, what's in them, and why they're important. Counties and cities that are not protected with strong ordinances will become targets for the next data center proposal. So I want to thank everyone again for joining, and especially the elected officials who are going to be taking it upon themselves to get some of these ordinances passed across the state. So moving on, we're going to hear from a few speakers tonight. We'll be joined at the end of the meeting by Representative Cindy Golding. We have Mayor Joanne Beer. We have Pam Mackey-Taylor, the Sierra Club Iowa Chapter Director. Wally Taylor is the Sierra Club Iowa Chapter Legal Chair and one of the best lawyers in the state. Myself, Jess Mazur, and then Brianna Coma from Sierra Club Iowa Chapter as well. So I'm going to start it off with passing it over to Brianna to start talking about a basic overview of data centers and concerns. So go ahead, Brianna.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jess. I really appreciate it. And so we will get started here. Thank you. So I just first wanted to start it and make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. So what exactly is a data center? A data center is a physical facility that houses thousands of computer servers, data storage systems, and networking equipment. These facilities process, store, and share enormous amounts of digital information. And so why are we suddenly seeing so many of them? And the biggest driver there is artificial intelligence. And these AI models run continuously and require dramatically more computing power than traditional internet servers. A single query to a large AI model consumes roughly 10 times the electricity of a standard Google search. So as AI continues to grow, big tech companies are racing to build larger and more powerful data centers. Next slide. And so why are so many companies looking at Iowa? And it's because we have so many characteristics that make it attractive to data center developers. We have relatively inexpensive flat land, access to large amounts of water, a reliable electric grid, and we're centrally located, making it easy to connect to the rest of the country. On top of that, Iowa has historically offered generous tax incentives for large developments. And unfortunately, while Iowa has many resources that companies want, like Jess mentioned, we have relatively few protections in place to ensure these projects are developed responsibly. That's one of the biggest reasons communities across the state are beginning to ask these questions before projects move forward. And so, what are our concerns? Next slide. So, we have four major concerns we hear over and over from communities and residents all across Iowa. And that first one is water. And water is a shared public resource, and communities deserve to understand how much will be used and what the long-term impacts could be. Some proposed data centers in Iowa could use millions of gallons of water a day. Increased water demand can place additional stress on rivers, aquifers, and municipal water systems, especially during drought periods and periods of high demand. And second is electricity demand. Data centers operate around the clock and consume enormous amounts of electricity that can require new substations, transmission lines, and other infrastructure. Residents are asking whether these costs could ultimately affect electric rates or require significant public investment. And third is quality of life. People living near proposed facilities often raise concerns about noise from cooling equipment and backup generators, along with lighting and construction traffic. Not to mention, these buildings occupy hundreds of acres, changing the rural landscape, property values, and the characteristic of communities. And lastly, the pace of the development. Communities tell us they feel like proposals are coming way too quick, often before local governments have had time to develop ordinances or policies. They're trying to make long-term decisions about communities without the tools or information that they need, which is why we need to slow things down to give communities and local leaders time to research and fact check these companies before diving in blindly. Preventative action is usually much less costly, whereas reactive action is often more difficult and expensive. This is especially important for communities who are already operating on tight budgets. Planning ahead can help avoid costly and complex surprises. And so, with that, next slide, we'll kind of talk about um, where are all of these data centers in Iowa currently. So we talk about this a lot, and it seems like, we're seeing it more and more, and it's because it's happening all across Iowa. And right now we are ranked 14th in the US for a number of operating data centers. Today, there are approximately 116 data centers throughout the state. We're also now seeing proposals for much larger hyperscale facilities, and communities are currently dealing with proposals including Clinton, West Des Moines, Ames, Palo, Hancock County, Charles City, Jefferson County, Salix, Cascade. But every few months, we're seeing more and more proposals. Another one pops up on this list. And so if you know of any others that aren't on this page right now, please put them in the chat. We're going to kind of try and create a little hub for where proposals are in the state right now, and which ones are currently already developed. So we would really appreciate your help with that. But we'll keep it moving. Next slide. One of the reasons data centers have become such an important topic is the sheer scale of resources they require. Like we kind of talked about in the concerns, but companies are looking for places with available land, reliable power, and access to a lot of water. And all these things Iowa has. So according to a January 2026 report highlighted by Consumer Reports, U.S. data center electricity demand is expected to nearly double in just 3 years, from 80 to 150 gigawatts. That's roughly equivalent to adding a country with the energy needs of Spain to our grid. And water demand is no different, also very significant. According to Environmental and Energy Study Institute, large data centers can consume up to 5 million gallons of water a day, roughly the daily use of a town with 10,000 to 50,000 residents, depending on their local data or water usage. And these projects are especially important for Iowa because we still have important questions to answer about our water resources. The state has not completed a comprehensive assessment of how increasing industrial water demand, particularly from large users like data centers, and how this could affect our aquifers over long term. It's also important to understand how cooling systems work within data centers. So many of these large data centers use evaporative cooling. This means that much of the water they withdraw evaporates into the atmosphere rather than returning directly to our rivers where it came from. That means the water remains part of the global water cycle, and there's no guarantee that that water will return as rainfall to the same community or watershed. That's why communities are asking for more information and long-term planning before approving projects with such significant water demands. And so, who are the big players in the data center game here in Iowa? Many companies pursuing these projects are some of the largest corporations in the world. It's common for negotiations to be conducted under non-disclosure agreements, otherwise known as NDAs, which can limit transparency throughout the project. That's one reason many communities are choosing to adopt ordinances because a proposal is announced. So on the screen, you can see these are the kind of big players here in Iowa, and these are global for-profit companies headquartered outside of Iowa. They often seek state and local incentives to support their developments while they can bring some investment to the communities. It's important to remember that their primary responsibility is to shareholders, not to Iowa's long-term interests. So I wanted to quickly share their fiscal 2025 profits to show how much these companies rake in after subtracting all business expenses, employee costs, and taxes. So Microsoft's profit was 100 billion, Google 132 billion, Meta 60 billion, Apple 112 billion. And QTS is privately owned, so their profits are not publicly available, but they are owned by Blackstone Group, which is one of the world's largest asset managers who specializes in real estate, private equity, and credit. So money. And I just wanted to share these numbers to kind of put it into perspective. These are among the most profitable companies in the world. When communities are asked to provide tax incentives, public infrastructure, or access to valuable resources like water and electricity, communities have every right to ask whether the agreement is fair, whether adequate protections are in place, and it's up to local and state government to ensure the public interest is protected and transparency is carried out. And so with that, we kind of go into Iowa isn't prepared for this yet. So we mentioned earlier the rapid growth of data centers and how it's outpaced Iowa's planning. Most communities have never had to think about regulating this type of development before, and many cities and counties don't have data center ordinances currently in place, and federal and state law provides very little guidance on issues like water use, infrastructure, transparency, or consumer protections. And as a result, local governments are often trying to answer very difficult questions with data that they don't have while a proposal is already moving forward. And so that's why preparation matters. It's much easier to establish community expectations before a project is proposed than after the fact. And so at the state level, Iowa currently has very few protections that specifically address data centers. There is no statewide setback requirements that establish minimum distance from homes or other sensitive areas. There are no specific protections to ensure residential electricity or water customers aren't negatively affected by increasing costs, infrastructure costs. There are no statewide quality of life standards addressing issues like noise and lighting. There are also limited transparency requirements, making it difficult for communities to understand the full scope of a proposed project early in the process. And finally, like I mentioned, Iowa has not completed a comprehensive statewide study examining how increasing industrial water demand could affect our aquifers and long-term water resources. And so with that, um, this is really where the conversation shifts from identifying all of these concerns to discussing the solutions. Communities across the state are exploring local ordinances, and state legislators are introducing new legislation. And so, with that, I would love to turn it over to Wally Taylor, who will discuss what local governments can do to prepare and how strong ordinances can help protect communities before proposals arrive. Thank you so much.
Thank you. As you've just heard, data centers are coming, and many counties and some cities are looking at adopting ordinances to regulate and protect from the impacts of data centers. There are a number of different kinds of ordinances, and it depends to a certain extent on what kind of um, arrangement the county or city has. If the city or county has zoning ordinances, they can plug this ordinance into their zoning ordinances. But some counties don't have zoning, and so we'll talk about how those counties can adopt an ordinance as well. Um, and it's a good idea for counties, even if they don't think there's a data center coming right away, it's good to get ahead of the curve, so to speak, and for counties and cities to adopt these ordinances ahead of time before there's a data center at the door. Um, a zoning ordinance, if the county or city has zoning, um, it should contain a number of different items. First, a preliminary statement to set out the legislative findings and the purpose of adopting the ordinance. The reason for that is that that gives a good basis for the ordinance so that it will stand up in court much better if they can show why they adopted this ordinance. For the counties and cities with zoning, some ordinances create a special use district for data centers. For example, Lynn County did that. And the data center becomes a permitted use in that special zoning district. The problem with that, or a concern that I have with that, is that the data center is almost automatically permitted. As long as the land itself is rezoned to put it in that special use district, the data center is a permitted use and it's automatic. And theoretically, the county could refuse to rezone the land, but that's unlikely. It would have to be a really improper use of that land in order to be able to stop the rezoning. A better approach was adopted by Allamakee County. In their ordinance, data centers are designated as a conditional use in an industrial district. What that means is that, first of all, the data center is considered like an industry and is placed in a district that's already zoned for industry. So you don't have to worry about rezoning. You don't have to worry about whether the land's compatible or not with the surrounding land. And as a conditional use, it isn't automatic. that the data center would be allowed, because a conditional use has to go before the Board of Adjustment and show why it should be allowed in that district. It isn't automatically permitted. If there's no zoning in the county, the ordinance would have some general requirements about where the data center could be located. And some general rules that I'll talk about that should be in all of these ordinances. The uniform requirements that in most of these ordinances concern first water use. You see here on the slide, protecting water. Some data center ordinances require the data center developer to fund an independent water study to determine what the water resources are, how much water the data center is going to require, and to see if there is any adverse impact from the water use of that data center. And hopefully the county or city would deny a permit if it finds that the impact is too great. Although the Lynn County ordinance, I didn't think had that kind of teeth in it. The Alameda County ordinance that I mentioned, which I consider to be the gold standard, required the data center to use either air cooling or a non-evaporative closed loop system, so that it uses no or very little water. And the ordinance should also have expectations during water emergencies or shortage. In other words, what happens if there isn't enough water, if there's a drought or whatever. And that really causes a problem, because the data centers need that water 24/7, and they do have backup generators. Those generators are diesel engines, and so they spew out all kinds of pollution and use diesel fuel. So it's a real a conundrum as to what to do. The Palo City ordinance that they just adopted doesn't require anything from the data center other than to get a permit from the Iowa Department of Natural Resources. And I won't go into all the gory details, but the DNR does not do a good job in determining whether an entity should be allowed to withdraw water or not as they request. The DNR just hands out these water withdrawal permits for the asking. And so that's a problem, I think, with the Palo ordinance. They rely on the DNR, and that's a false reliance. Some other aspects of the ordinances that most ordinances have or should have are an economic development agreement or community benefits agreement, which can provide some benefit to the community and force the data center to be a good neighbor, so to speak. But it really doesn't get at these impacts that we've been talking about from the data centers. So it's just kind of a feel-good thing that I don't think really solves the problems. There are also limits on noise. And the data center developer is required to do a noise analysis as to how much noise the data center will produce. And the standard is either 50 to 65 decibels on the average. But whether or not that's the right amount, there's some dispute about that, but that seems to be the standard. Setbacks. There's always a dispute about how much of a setback there should be. Setbacks from residences, from community centers, public spaces, and some ordinances have maybe like 200 feet, some have maybe a quarter of a mile. It depends on where they are. Certainly in a city, it can't be that much, but if that's the case, should that data center be in the city or should it be out in the county? What happened in Lynn County was that the Lynn County supervisors passed this ordinance, and Google, which was going to build some data centers in the county, backed out of that arrangement and went to the city of Palo and is asking to be annexed into the city of Palo and is getting a better deal. So you want to make sure that government entities are not competing against each other to get these data centers. Lighting is another issue that should be in the ordinances, and there are ways to limit the lighting, either in terms of color, in terms of where the lights are pointed, in terms of what times of day or night the lighting is used. So those are things that ought to be in the ordinance as well. Emergency response. What if something goes wrong? What if a computer inside the data center blows up, or what if there's a fire or something like that? The data center needs to be responsible for the emergency response. There should be protections of the environment. Make sure the data centers are not imposing on wetlands or natural areas of some sort, or that they are in an area where they will be compatible with the environment. Electricity. The ordinances cannot really limit the electricity. That's up to other entities to do, but certainly the ordinance can require the data center to disclose how much energy it's going to use, where it's going to come from, and perhaps that could even be a reason to deny a zoning permit for the data center. If the electricity is going to impact the residents of the county or the city in terms of being too much of a load on the electric system, or affecting people's electric rates. Now, certainly the Utility Commission has jurisdiction over electric rates, but still, the counties or cities could use that in determining whether to permit a data center or not. If the data center is out in the county and it's going to be on agricultural land, some ordinances require that it be on land that has a cone suitability rating below a certain level, usually 55 or 60. So those are some of the things that need to be in the data center ordinances. As you approach your county or city governments about data center ordinances, first encourage them to do it, and then make sure that the whole process is transparent. The data center developers like to go in, talk to the elected officials, community leaders, all under the cover of darkness, so to speak. They are public about this, and it's almost a done deal before the public knows. Many times the data centers require the public officials to sign non-disclosure agreements. That should be illegal. This should be a public process. So those are things you need to be aware of. So let's go to the next slide. This slide shows where we currently have data center ordinances and or moratoria on ordinances or on a permitting for data centers. You see Lynn County, they have both. They have an ordinance, and then they decided, well, we didn't do a good enough job, so they're now imposing a moratorium on data centers to take another look at their ordinance. As I said, some of them have the county zoning, some do not. Some of them are very strong. Some of them are not as strong. So the important thing about this map to me is, look how many counties in the gray areas do not have ordinances. If you're in those counties, go to your county supervisors, go to your city councils in those counties, and to request that your county officials adopt ordinances or moratoria before they adopt ordinances so that they can do a good job in protecting the public from data centers that might come into those counties. So with that, I'll leave the rest for questions and answers at the end. I could go on for a long time, but I won't.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Wally. So yeah, if you're in a county that only has a moratorium or in a gray county that doesn't have anything, get to work because there's a target on those counties' backs because they think they can come in and take advantage before the community gets prepared. And like Wally said, don't wait until a data center comes to town. The best thing to do is to get it done ahead of time and spend time thinking through what do you want to protect in your community. I'm going to go over the general process of how you pass an ordinance, but keep in mind this is different every single time in every single county, especially counties where they're not super eager to pass an ordinance. It may take longer and it may be a bit harder, but this is just the general process if everything goes exactly how you want it to go. You'll start out with contacting your supervisors or city council, because remember, these ordinances can be passed at the county level or by city council. And or the planning department, just someone at the city or county, and ask them to pass a data center ordinance. See what they say, present some information to them. And if you find out that they're unwilling or uninterested, you're going to have to organize your community to put a little pressure on them. You can do things like starting a Facebook group, getting your friends and family to attend a meeting, lots of different ways, but you're going to have to convince them to do this. Once they've agreed to draft an ordinance, they're going to probably direct the planning and zoning to actually draft the language of the ordinance. So it's important to make sure they have some of these templates for especially the Al-McKee County ordinance, which we'll send to everyone who's RSVP to this webinar. And then you're going to work with your elected officials to make sure it's the strongest possible. So, make sure that you're paying attention to the parts about water and the parts about noise and lights and make it as strong as possible. The Planning and Zoning Commission is probably going to hold a public meeting for input, so you want to make sure you're going to get a lot of people there. And once they've finalized the draft, they're going to send it back up to the city council or the supervisors, where they're going to hold 1 to 3 public meetings where they're actually going to take input on the draft of the ordinance. And at the very final meeting, that is when they will vote, and you'll need a majority in order to get that ordinance passed. Now, keep in mind, this might go as smoothly as it looks on the screen, or it might be very difficult. And so one thing that we thought would be really good to look at is a case study and actually talk about, what does it look like when you're going through this process. So we've invited Mayor Joanne Beer. She is the mayor of Fairfax, and she's going to talk about what she's been doing in her community and also the surrounding communities as well. So thank you, Mayor Beer.
And thank you, Jess, for the introduction and for inviting me to participate in this webinar. I'm always happy to share Fairfax's experiences to date with data centers. A little bit about Fairfax to provide some background. We're a small community with a population of about 3,000. We are part of the Cedar Rapids, Iowa City corridor, about less than 5 miles from the Eastern Iowa Airport. We share northeast and east borders with Cedar Rapids, and our other borders we share with Lynn County. And if you look at the map that's displaying right now, I'll talk about the Cedar Rapids data centers and what close proximity they are to Fairfax. You see Fairfax's city limits outlined in yellow there. If you go clear to the lower right-hand corner and go just a little bit below, the city limits doesn't show quite correctly, but if you move your pointer up just a tiny bit, that's 76th Avenue and fondly known as Data Center Alley in our area. We have 2 huge data center projects going on in Cedar Rapids. QTS is the one closest to Fairfax. You just step over our eastern boundaries and you're in QTS data center land, which consists of 612 acres, 7 buildings, consisting of anywhere from 400,000 to 1.2 million square feet each. If you go further to the east and a little bit to the north, that's Google. They have 414 acres and 4 buildings, all of which are in Cedar Rapids city limits, not Fairfax. However, we do have one small area right inside our city limits on the eastern boundary that we have a development agreement with QTS for a laydown area, otherwise known as a parking lot, because data center constructions need lots of parking lots for literally the thousands and thousands of workers that are there on a daily basis. So that's just a little background of where we're at. What Fairfax has been facing for the past year is those thousands of temporary construction workers traveling through our community. We are have 2 state highways, Highway 151 and Highway 30 to our north, that are easy access to Fairfax and heavily traveled for the construction workers going to the construction site. That is something we never dreamt that would occur and really have had no say in the matter at all. And reaping very little benefits from all of the construction that's going on. We have seen impacts in addition to traffic. We've also seen it impacting our housing supply, and that all these temporary workers have to have somewhere to live. Being a small community, we don't have a hotel or a motel, but what few housing and apartments are available for rent are basically being taken over by the temporary construction workers. If that could be a good thing for some communities, but not in the case of Fairfax, because it's actually preventing families from living in those same residents. Other things that we're experiencing is the lighting. The project areas is lit up 24/7, and it's almost like we are residing next to the Eastern Iowa Airport parking lots, but it's actually the data center. So, experiencing the negative, very little of the positive. How is Fairfax preparing for the next step? Because as Wally mentioned, Lynn County has passed a data center ordinance for the unincorporated areas of Lynn County. And also at the same time, they passed now a moratorium. So what is likely to happen because of the moratorium is that we will have more data center developers approaching Fairfax and other communities in the area to try to build within our city limits. So we're in the process now of developing our own ordinance, data center ordinance. And how we started is we took the Lynn County ordinance and we cut and paste that one, and then we've added some additional restrictions, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. That is different than Palo's approach, which Wally also mentioned. Palo did not include the required water study in their ordinance. So that's where we differ with the city of Palo and how we're approaching the ordinance. We're making them stronger, and they've eliminated some things. And I've visited Palo a couple of times in their public meetings and expressed concerns over the water, and also shared some of our experiences with the traffic, just to be good neighbors and give them heads up on some of those things. So another thing, in addition to us working on an ordinance, is we've actually formed 2 special committees that are headed by city council members so that we can focus on a couple aspects of data centers outside of our regular city council meetings. We've established a traffic committee and also a water committee, because we know that those are going to be ongoing concerns. And our council is actually looking at a potential moratorium, because we don't want to rush through the ordinance process. So we want to have plenty of time, because it seems like we're learning something new every single day. Every meeting I go to, I hear about some aspect that, oh, we better get that included in our ordinance. We haven't done that yet. So the council is seriously considering a moratorium, so that buys us some time. So if you go to the next slide, please, we'll talk about some of the things that we're including in our ordinance. It's not completed yet. I'm sorry, it's right there. Zoning and district limitations, structural setbacks. And we talk about structural setbacks, that is, how close can they be to a residential area, for example, or any area where housing is. And then let's provide some visual buffering. Also, utility and environmental safeguards. That can include some of the things that Wally mentioned as well. We are going to require a water study to come along with any application for a data center. That's extremely important to us. Another thing that hasn't been mentioned yet this evening is, where is the stormwater runoff going to go, and what about protecting our streams? When you have a huge development like we're seeing just to the east of Fairfax, huge parking lots and lots of roofs, where's that water going to go, the runoff from those roofs and the parking lots? And what about our streams that are nearby? So we're including some protection in our proposed data center ordinance. Also, the electrical grid impact. The QTS data centers are not live yet. That can be happening anytime within the next couple of weeks. We were thankful nothing was live last week when we experienced the extreme heat, because we want to know what's going to happen if there's electrical alerts and potential brownouts. What kind of impact are the data centers going to have on that aspect? We also are adding some noise and performance control, experiencing decibel ratings, lighting. I mentioned being lit up 24/7, and these things, the decibel ratings, would be checked annually. Also, Wally had encouraged host community agreements, and we're including that in our ordinance, the financial and public safety agreement. Another thing that we've really experienced in Fairfax is our surrounding roads were not designed to accommodate thousands of temporary construction workers and the construction equipment itself. So we feel very strongly about ordinances having road use agreements contained within them in order to provide some contribution financially from the developers and other kinds of contribution. For example, Fairfax is strictly a volunteer fire department, yet we are the closest responders to the Cedar Rapids data centers. Cedar Rapids is primarily responsible, but we are the closest responders. So in the case of a large fire, we're going to be the ones responding. And as a small volunteer fire department, we don't have all the training and equipment that may be required to be involved in such a thing. So we have included those kinds of aspects in our ordinance. It has not been finalized. It has not been scrutinized by the public yet. And like I say, every meeting that I attend, I hear about something new that we should potentially be included. Not all the ordinances are going to be a one size fits all. For example, I visited with some people from Clinton last night. They're in a totally different situation than Fairfax, but I think the basics, as Wally pointed out, should be included in every single agreement. And keep looking at it, don't rush, and make sure it's strong and everybody's in agreement, because Iowa, we're all in this together. Thank you. And Jess, are you going to introduce Cindy, or?
Yes, yeah. Thank
Okay.
you very much, Mayor Beer. We really appreciate all the work that you've done and the information that you're bringing to the table because, like you said, we're still learning about this every day too. And so, what we consider the best ordinance today, maybe in 6 months, we realize, well, we need to go back to the table and add these and these and these pieces to make it even better. So continuing on, the last little bit of information is kind of taking action. What can we do about this? We've talked about these ordinances. We talked about why they're important, and we know that communities that don't have ordinances are going to have targets on their back. And if a data center comes and it doesn't want to abide by an ordinance that protects water and quality of life and electricity rates and transparency, then maybe that's a good sign for the community. They don't want that company to come to town. So these ordinances serve lots of different purposes. The first thing that you can do, and I highly recommend this, is drive by a data center. We can tell you all about this. You can look at these pictures, but until you've actually driven by one and rolled down your window out of your car and listened to it, it doesn't do it justice. So I highly recommend drive by a data center. And, if you really want to see some big ones and get the full experience, I recommend the area near Fairfax and Cedar Rapids. There's also a ton in Des Moines that you can drive by as well. Secondly, this is how your first steps to take action. Contact your supervisors or your city councils. Let them know your concerns. Let them know that you want an ordinance. Ask them what are they doing. Maybe they're already planning on it, or maybe they haven't even thought about it yet. Make sure they have copies of the template ordinances that we're going to send you all tomorrow for everyone who RSVP'd. You're probably not going to be able to do this on your own. If it were that easy to get things done, we'd have a lot more things done in our state. So you're going to need to get some people together, your friends, your family, your neighbors, start a petition, create a Facebook group, write a letter to the editor so that it's not just you talking about this, but it's your whole community. You could hold a meeting. Maybe you just want to hold an educational meeting for your community so people can start learning before they take action. Plan a meeting. We can help with that. Reach out to us and we can help plan a community meeting. And then most importantly, be involved in the process. If you're not there asking for the strongest ordinance possible, it's going to get weaker and weaker because those data center companies are there lobbying those city council members and supervisors to weaken the ordinance. So be involved throughout the process. Next up, we have Representative Cindy Golding, because like we said, right now this is on local communities to take action because we don't have any statewide protections. But Representative Golding has been working on a couple bills, and I have a strong feeling that we're going to see more in the future. But Representative Golding, can you tell us about the bills that you've been working on, what's in them, and what do we need to do to get them passed?
Sure. I think first, let's talk about data centers because when you go to these community meetings, you'll hear we've had data centers for decades. And a data center is an offsite storage of your internet data. Our company had an offsite provider so that if our computers crashed, there were servers offsite that had our data. So their data centers exist in many different sizes. Some data centers can live in your community and you never know it, but we're talking about these hypercenters or AI data centers that are the ones that are the most destructive. So don't be dissuaded by when somebody says, "Oh, well, you've had a data center here forever and you didn't know it." Well, it's much smaller, and I started describing it like driving around in your golf cart on the golf course down the golf path, and then pretty soon somebody comes along with a semi. These are things that, I mean, the difference between a golf cart and a semi are what we're talking about for data storage. Now, I had a data center transparency bill that did not restrict any construction, did not require setbacks or anything. What it did was required the the company proposing a data center to disclose its transparency, disclose how much energy they were going to use and would it affect ratepayers, how much water they were going to use, what the water source was, what they would be doing with the effluent, and then what were they going to be doing with the excess heat. Now, that is very simplified. We originally had in there in the bill wanting to know what kind of tax credits they were getting or tax incentives, and also what the tariff on the electricity was. But that was amended out in committee. So we had a bill, it's House File 2690, that was merely, it was about transparency. And it applied to any data center that was currently existing so the communities could know for future planning. That passed the committee, the Commerce Committee in the House unanimously, and it was held up because the Google and Nextera and others were pushing back, and the speaker did not bring it to the floor. The other bill we had was protecting our aquifers. So currently, the DNR evaluates the economic impact and an industrial class of a permit requester. So they look at the industrial impact before they evaluate any water or any of the impact on removing water. And my bill was the DNR was to evaluate the available water and the impact on the surrounding communities before they issued the permit. This passed the House with, it was 90-1, and the one legislator that voted against it was because ADM was pushing back really hard. And just to understand, we are an agricultural state. In Cedar Rapids, we have food processing that consumes an enormous amount of water. We also have our ethanol plants across the state that consume enormous amounts of water. And when we start talking about this advanced manufacturing, many of those companies also use an incredible amount of water. Generation of electricity uses an incredible amount of water. So we need to be very, very careful about our natural resource. And how many people heard this past summer, or the summer before, that there was a water restriction for watering their yards or whatever, but there was no limit on the industrial consumers. So I'm working very hard on this. But the other thing I'd like people to understand is there's a lot more impact in your community than simply electricity and water. As Joanne was indicating in Fairfax, and quite frankly, all around Cedar Rapids, um, rental units are going, you can't find a decent rental place because these temporary employees are given a per diem and they don't care how much they pay when they move into our town. So it drives the housing market exceptionally high for our long-term residents. The other thing that happens is if you imagine how much of the resources being used to build this, um, friends of mine have plumbing companies, they're electricians, they're HVAC contractors, and their employees are being taken away for short term for very high wages, which is beneficial to those employees for the short term. But the rest of us who live here, you try to hire an electrician, you try to hire a plumber, they're all down at the data center. Another thing that happens, as Joanne mentioned, is the damage to the roads, the immense amount of traffic, but other things that you don't think of. You need a load of gravel to fix the county road, and everybody who's delivering gravel is consumed with the data center. All the concrete contractors are consumed with the data center. And there's this I'm a landlord. I interviewed some prospective tenants for one of our houses, and the quality of the people that they're bringing in from out of state was appalling. I I wouldn't rent to any of them. They had a criminal record an arm's length long, and in Cedar Rapids, we do a background check on our potential tenants. And I was shocked. In 40 years of renting real estate, I have never had prospective tenants with criminal records that these people had. So not only do we have the impact on our communities for our environmental things, we have to be careful of the kind of people that they're bringing in as temporary employees. And that, you know, it overwhelms our resources. So anything else, Jess?
No, I think that's it. Thank you very much, Representative Golding. We look forward to working with you next session, and I have a feeling if all this county work, we might get some additions to these bills, maybe some amendments or something.
Oh, I hope so. Well, the other thing, so I'd like to mention, much like we had to do in the carbon sequestration process, is it becomes our responsibility to help our neighbors understand how it impacts them. So
Mhm.
like here in Lynn County, I've heard, oh, well, that Save Morgan Valley, that's not going to impact me. But once a data center is approved, then the IUC by code in Iowa is required to provide the energy for the new industrial complexes. And so they have the power of eminent domain. Now I'm looking at where that Save Morgan Valley, where the gas-fired generator is supposed to go, and where the data centers are, they have the power of eminent domain for those transmission lines. They have the power of eminent domain for the gas supply lines. They have the power of eminent domain for every substation. So we need to let our neighbors, our families, the people around us know that this is going to impact everybody.
100%. Well, thank you again, and we will be talking to you soon before January. All right, last thing, just to mark your calendar for us, we're going to be having another webinar on Thursday, September 3rd. It'll be in the evening. We don't have the time picked out yet, but it'll be about engaging candidates on these issues as we head into the election season. So with that, here's our contact info. For everyone who registered, you will receive an email tomorrow, probably, that's going to have a recording. You'll get a copy of the presentation, and we'll get some template ordinances, especially the Al-McKee ordinance, in everyone's hands so you can get to work. But please drive by a data center and get the process started in your city or in your county or both, because we know these data centers are looking for places that they can come in and not have to pay extra for special lighting or noise controls and not have to worry about how much water they use. And so it's important that we get ahead of the game and we get these ordinances passed and then work with our state legislators to get statewide protections passed as well. So with that, we are going to switch over to Q&A. We have quite a few questions here in the chat and in the Q&A. So Brian, if you want to help me start picking through some of these questions, and then anyone who wants to jump in. First question here is, do we know if data centers are regular data centers or AI data centers? They're different, which I think Representative Golding explained that a little bit ago, but I'm not sure if you want to hop in, Representative Golding or Wally, or.
Sure, I'll start and then Wally can take it from there. There are the small data centers. So, for example, like I said, we hired an offsite IT company to store our data, and there are data centers even so that's one kind of operation that stores data, and then it goes up. There's 5 different terms for it, but all of these are step up in size to the hypercenter, the AI data center. And those are the ones that are the most destructive to our environment and our utilities and our communities.
Thank you. Oh, did you want to add anything, Wally, or next question?
Well, it just seems abundantly clear that as AI is more in front of us the last 2 or 3 years, that's exactly when we're seeing the profusion of these hyperscale data centers. So obviously it's because of AI.
Yeah. Next question.
I just want to bring up the other thing that's driving some of this, as everybody probably on this call has heard, the flock cameras that want to get all your bio
Oh, yeah,
metrics
yeah.
and everything. And so without these data centers, without these AI centers, they won't have the capacity to do the surveillance on us that they're looking for.
Yeah, it really does connect everything. Next question here is this person wrote, our supervisors insist the data centers are the best thing since sliced bread. Do we know anything about the additional property taxes they will bring in? Are they actually bringing in any revenue to communities?
They will bring in property taxes, but how much subsidies are they getting? What about all the other impacts? Um, it certainly is um, a conundrum that the local officials are under. Um, and I don't know if I'm stepping on Representative Golding's toes or not, but when you reduce property taxes, you're reducing the income for these local governments, and
Oh,
they
I know.
they feel like they're um, forced to find other sources of property tax revenue, I'm afraid.
Well, that's one of the concerns we have is that because of the NDAs, we don't know what kind of deals they're making. I have spoken with many people who have been involved in some of the conversations, but they are anonymously telling me what's going on. And there are opportunities for the cities to really make some revenue that would reduce property taxes that would go to benefit the community um, if they take advantage of it. But we're talking about short-term returns with long-term destruction of our farmland, of our environment, of our water, of our, to what end? And is this what we want for Iowa? Do we want to be a massive industrial complex, or do we want to be an agricultural state? So that's part of the conversation that is being missed.
Absolutely. Um, and this we kind of touched on a little bit ago, but someone's asking, can eminent domain be used for data centers?
I don't think so. I don't know how it could. It 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 certainly is not a public use, and it's not statutorily permitted like it would be for something that's permitted by the Utility Commission. So I I don't see how it could be uh, subject to eminent domain.
Right.
But
And
but if there are transmission lines that come in for it, or if they build a gas plant to um, service data centers, an eminent domain could be used for the transmission lines or the generation plant.
does a county ordinance only have effect if the data center is not located within a city? It's like it's kind of a jurisdiction question.
Yep, that's right. That's what happened in Lynn County. And
Yeah.
Lynn County passed an ordinance for data centers outside incorporated areas. So then Google decided to be annexed into Palo so that the Palo ordinance would apply and not the Lynn County ordinance.
One of the things I've done is there are 11 communities in my district, 11 cities. So I've visited every one of the city councils and encouraged them to have an ordinance in place, because every one of my small communities, and the largest one is Ely with just over 2,000 people, um, every one of them is surrounded by enough farmland that as these corporations are going in and offering 60 to $100,000 an acre or more, the landowners outside the city could be enticed into selling their land to a data center. And if the city is not already prepared with ordinances in place, they're going to be backed into a corner. And quite frankly, I warned Palo long before they turned down Lynn County, and they weren't interested in listening.
This is a good question, and it's popped up in the chat quite a few times. Someone said, these data centers, they take more than they give. So
Yeah.
someone's asking, so how are counties and citizens benefiting from data centers, or are they?
I'll jump
I
in
can't
again.
answer that one.
So you get what you measure. Okay. So I want to think about schools when we mandated graduation rates were celebrated regardless of the academic qualifications of the students graduating. We got graduation rates and some of our academics started slipping. You got to see what is being measured. When a community is measured on how many outside dollars are coming in for development, that gives cities all kinds of brownie points. And you have to start seeing what is being measured. But the flip side, is that benefiting the local citizens, the long-term residents, or is it simply again to that quarterly return mentality? Is it a short-term glitch that really destroys your environment?
I'd like to weigh in just a little bit from Fairfax's perspective as well. Um, the proposed gas fuel power plant, that if it happens will be located just less than 2 miles to the north and the west of Fairfax. If that occurs, we've already had some developers approaching us for data centers to fill in hundreds of acres with data centers to our north and our west. That will basically stop Fairfax's growth because our main growth area is to the northwest. And we talk about what is the benefit of all of that. Potentially, if they were within our city limits, we would have increased property tax revenue. However, I always make the statement, we could get all the money in the world, but if nobody wants to live here, what good is it
Right.
going to do us?
Right.
Really good point. Really good point. Switching gears a little bit, does anyone know how many people these data centers typically employ once they're operating?
We're being told anywhere from a dozen to 20 per building.
Thank you. And this one might be for Representative Golding or Mayor Beer, someone in the Lynn County area. Could you send an address or like a street name for that data center alley if people want to drive by for themselves? Maybe put that in the chat or share it.
Joanne, you tell them.
76th Avenue. 76th Avenue starts approximately in Fairfax and heads east and goes all the way beyond Kirkwood Community College. And the alley portion starts at our eastern city limits and goes almost to practically to 6th Street in Cedar Rapids now. That was originally farmland, and now it is an industrial park.
Yeah. And if you're in the Des Moines area, just south of Des Moines on 35 South, you can see it on the west side of the interstate around the Cumming exit. And you can pull off on the Cumming exit and go on the gravel roads and drive around it. And I mean, it's pretty astounding. They're loud. It's you got to see it to really get the full experience.
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone know anything about the heat islands that are a projected consequence of AI data centers?
It all depends on how they do their cooling and whether they let the heat just uh, escape or whether they trap it and reuse it. That was part of the transparency bill, and I need to thank Wally for helping with that and really putting a lot of work into it. But it all depends on the technology that they use.
Okay.
As
Another question.
anybody knows, I mean, if you've been in an office, like we had an office with 38 people, we had our server room, and we had to have one air conditioner just for that server room in our office building. So it had to have its own special air conditioner, and that's one little company with one little server room. So magnify that, by a million times.
All right. Another question, what can responders do once our city council has sold land for the data center to build a data center near our town? The person really tried to sell the benefits of the data center that most of the residents knew were not accurate. What can they do now? Wally, you got any thoughts on that? If like you know, a community bought in on false information, it sounds like.
All you can do is make a lot of noise. And I suppose if you could show that somehow the decision was made on false information, you could maybe challenge the decision in court saying that it was arbitrary and capricious and made under false pretenses, that kind of thing. That's a tough one. That's a tough one.
Yeah.
But the only thing that we're including in our ordinance is such as the noise factor. We're going to measure that annually, but you have to then have very strong penalties associated with that and realize you're talking about billion-dollar companies, whereas your normal civil infraction of $150 is not going to do anything for you.
Right. We've heard that data centers are short term and will be outdated in 5 to 10 years. Have any of you heard that?
Absolutely. I have been courted in my private life to be an investor in some of these data compression companies where they already know how they compress data, 10,000 times or what. I'm not a techie. So I have been courted by them to invest in their companies. I also know my son is a computer genius, and he's telling me, Mom, it's not 5 years out. That technology will be here in 2 to 3 years. But we're going to look at this in the same way that you look at cell phones versus landlines. We've had cell phones since the 80s. I had my bag phone in 1989, but how long the telephone companies held on because of the investment they had in the infrastructure. And there's a lot of people that still have landlines, even though our cell phones are much more efficient. So once the money is in the infrastructure, they are going to fight like crazy to keep the other technology at bay because they have such tremendous investment.
Yeah, and I was listening to a video or podcast this weekend about data centers and how there were some theories that the industry is growing so fast, everyone's in a race to get their data center in, that in the end we may have more than we really need. And then we've got stranded assets, people just abandoning these facilities all across the country and then leaving local communities with the risk, which is why decommissioning is a really important aspect of an ordinance as well.
I think it's also like the dot-com bubble that we saw back in 1999, 2000. People were investing in them because they thought it was a way to get rich quick, and the bubble burst. And I think that's what's going to happen here. A lot of this data center, well, they say the stock market up and down is based on data center or AI investments. And when the people find out that there's nothing there to invest in, it's going to burst.
Mm-hmm. The difference is we're going to have all these massive big buildings sitting there. And what I've heard, and I've heard this from a reliable source, that there are not enough server components to fill these data centers to bring them up to and running. So they're building the boxes, but they don't have enough supplies. The supply chain cannot supply enough of the servers and the technology that to get them up and running. We know there's a backlog on transformers, so as they're putting these substations in and everything, there simply is not the parts just aren't there.
Yeah. Someone's asking if our Secretary of Ag could play a role in this, and specifically in limiting how much acreage the state can be covered in data centers. Is that something Secretary of Ag can do, or is that legislature?
Uh,
Not sure. Yeah, that's something we don't have in Iowa. We've not set any limits on this in any way, shape, or form. Sorry, I've gotten through all of the questions that are in Q&A. I'm looking through the chat right now. So, Brandon, if you see any in there that we've missed, you can come off of mute and ask them as I scan through here. Oh, um, so this is for Mayor Beer. Why aren't you enacting a ban rather than an ordinance? Or why aren't you just doing a ban instead of an ordinance?
We actually are looking at that. It was proposed by a council member about a month ago, but in order to follow our processes, because it affects zoning considerations, we have to go to Planning and Zoning Commission first before it goes to council. And that potentially can happen in 2 weeks and then go before the council 2 weeks after that. So it looks like that could occur.
I think the question actually was, why not do a ban rather than a moratorium? And the answer is that you can't totally ban something unless it's declared to be illegal. And I don't know that a local government can declare a data center illegal. I'd like to, but I don't think you can.
Right. I agree with what Wally just said. Yes.
Thank you. Who's going to police data centers in Iowa? And I'm assuming that, making sure the electricity bills aren't getting passed on or making sure they're only using the amount of water they say they're using. Do we have a state agency for this?
Well, we have the IUC and we have the DNR that's supposed to go back and verify things. So even when we put forth the water bill that required the DNR to evaluate the water source first, ADM called me, a number of different people from ADM called me for the weeks that it was coming up because they wanted to be grandfathered in. So we have the structure, and whether or not it's enforced is another story.
Yeah, and I can say my experience with the DNR around water is they're not really paying attention. There's a lot of self-reporting and not a lot of monitoring going on. So really, we don't have the structure in place to ensure that these data centers would even follow the rules that they're supposed to be held to.
Well, it's like any law is only as effective as it's enforced. We can put a lot of stuff on paper.
Yep.
It doesn't do any good unless it's enforced.
Yeah. Wally, this one's for you. This question has come up whether we've worked on Pattison sand or carbon pipelines or now data centers. Has the DNR actually ever denied or reduced a water permit request?
No. In fact, the deposition was taken of the DNR employees who's the head of the water use bureau, or whatever they call it. And he said it was like 2,000 or 3,000 permits they'd issued. They'd never denied one. Pattison Sand a few years ago was as close as they ever came, but they didn't actually deny it. They just said they needed more information. And then Pattison just said, yeah, the economics had changed, and so they dropped their application. And then more recently, Pattison is back for more, and we've been able to delay, but the DNR still issued draft permits, and they still haven't issued a final permit, but they haven't denied it either. You're on mute.
You're mute.
Yep, thank you. I see one more question here. So if you have a question that we missed, make sure you get that in the chat now. Otherwise, it looks like this might be the last one. And has Iowa ever considered a compute tax? An AI compute tax?
I don't know. That was brought to my attention last week by, how many bits of information or bytes or however that could be done. Wally, do you know? I don't believe there is anything out there. I did a search of the code and I didn't see anything.
No, I've never heard of a compute tax, frankly.
Well, I'd assume it'd be, however much data is used or resources used, they'd get taxed on it, but an interesting idea. I don't,
Well,
I
that's
wonder
how
how
they
they
make
would.
their money. You know, they charge by that supposedly, and I don't know, again, I'm not a techie, but so the guy that told me about it says, how do you think they're making their money? It's the amount of data that they are handling, they charge their clients. So there's got to be some measurable way, if they're charging people for it, that we could charge them.
absolutely. All right, we got one more question. Which data center is the loudest? So it sounds like someone wants to go drive by and get the full experience. Is it Data Center Alley, or is there a specific one someone wants to recommend driving by?
Well, none of the data centers on Data Center Alley are live yet, so don't go by. You can go by them. I think a visual is very good, but they're not turned on yet.
So then I would recommend, at least my personal experience, the ones I've driven by are south of Des Moines, and it's very loud, and you'll get the full experience. But we did put the link to the map in the chat, so you can kind of find one near you. Keep in mind they're not all the same size, so just go find some in the area that you want to go check out, and we'll put that in the email tomorrow too, so you have a map of where they're at. Is there anything else anyone of our guest speakers would like to add before we wrap it up this evening? All right. Well, thank you again to our guest speakers. Thank you to everyone in attendance. And now we've got a lot of work to do. These are coming in fast, but we now have some clear action steps that we can take to get ahead of the game and make sure that these data centers don't take over our state. So thank you all. Look for an email in your email tomorrow, and we'll have the recording, we'll have the presentation, some links to maps and ordinances and everything. So thank you and have a great evening. Bye.